Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for the Transformative Action webinar series. My name is Chelsea Karst, and I'd like to take a brief moment to talk about the Ontario Trillium Foundation and why we partnered with Tamarack to deliver this series. If it's the first time you're hearing about the Ontario Trillium Foundation, there are two important things you should know. First, we are an agency of the Government of Ontario. And second, as one of Canada's leading grant-making foundations, we fund over $100 million a year to support projects in communities across Ontario. The mandate of the foundation is to build healthy and vibrant communities across Ontario, and we use our action areas to define what we mean by that. They are our vision and what we aspire to achieve. On the screen, you will see those 6 action areas. They are as follows. Active people, with the goal of fostering more active lifestyles. Connected people, which is aimed at building inclusive and engaged communities. Green people, which is all about encouraging communities to support a healthy and sustainable environment. Inspired people, that's goal is to enrich lives through arts, culture, and heritage. Promising young people, that aims to support the positive development of children and youth, particularly those who face barriers. And finally, prosperous people, which aims to enhance Ontario's economic well-being, moving people from crisis to economic opportunity. We believe here at the Foundation, if we can make a measurable impact in those 6 areas, we will be able to achieve our mandate. Following this webinar, if you have any interest in learning more about the Ontario Trillium Foundation and its funding streams, you can visit our website, www.otf.ca. Or please feel free to contact our support center directly using the phone number or the email on the screen. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoyed the webinar on shared measurements.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce our webinar speaker for today, Liz Weaver. Liz is the co-CEO of Tamarack Institute, where she's leading the Tamarack Learning Center. The Tamarack Learning Center has a focus on advancing community change efforts and does this by focusing on 5 strategic areas, including collective impact, collaborative leadership, community engagement, community innovation, and evaluating community impact. Liz is well known for her thought leadership on collective impact and is the author of several popular and academic papers on the topic. She is a co-catalyst partner with the Collective Impact Forum and leads the Collective Impact Capacity Building Strategy with the Ontario Trillium Foundation. So big welcome to you, Liz, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Pooja, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the webinar. Today we're going to talk about shared measurement, and the whole idea of this webinar, we have kind of 3 goals that we're trying to achieve. One is to deepen your understanding of the concept of shared measurement and its applicability, not only to collective impact, but also to transformative change. We have a couple of tools that we want to share with you at the end of the webinar, so it'll help, hopefully these tools and approaches will help you build your practice around shared measurement. And we also want you to begin thinking about shared measurement mapping, because that's really one of the early steps that you should have in this process. So those are our goals for the webinar, and hopefully over the course of the day, we'll be able to, or course of the hour, we'll be able to achieve those. The next slide, this slide really looks at personal reflection, and part of this webinar series, we're really wanting it to be quite interactive, and so we want you to use the chat box all throughout the course of the webinar and post your questions, your thoughts, your best practices in the chat box. And here's a question for you to begin thinking about. So what are your big challenges with employing a shared measurement approach in your collaborative effort? So it's really thinking about, okay, so where have you bumped up against things that haven't worked so well for you, or where are some practices where things have worked extremely well for you? During the course of the webinar, post those in the chat box and we will reflect on them at the end of the webinar. So thanks so much for that. Now we're going to go to a poll. So I'm going to have my colleague Duncan help me with this poll. The poll is really, what is your biggest challenge with shared measurement? And we have 5 areas in this poll that we've identified. So difficulty in identifying the appropriate measures, lack of knowledge and capacity, lack of resources to undertake shared measurement, and the length of time that it gets to population level outcomes or other. So if you can vote now, that would be great. Pick one of them. And then we'll try to see where our audience is at in terms of the biggest challenges with shared measurement. So if we could close the poll in 5 seconds. Great, so if we could have the poll results, that would be helpful. So here are the poll results that you can see on your screen. Lots of you have challenges in identifying the appropriate measures, and we're going to share with you some strategies that different organizations and different collective impact efforts have used in terms of figuring out their appropriate measures. Some of you have identified the second highest was lack of resources, and that is a real challenge in this shared measurement work, but there are ways to get around the lack of resources and then the lack of knowledge and capacity. Those are the three big challenges, and hopefully we'll be able to address some of those challenges throughout the course of the webinar today. If we could take us back to the webinar slide. Here we go. So there are some really important reasons to track population level change, and this is really when we're involved in the business of transformative community change. We really want to figure out what in the community is actually changing or what we hope to have in the community change. So the reasons to track population level change is getting to that level of community change. It does three things. It reinforces our ambition. It allows us to kind of focus on a needle that we want to move. It sharpens our strategic thinking and learning. So not only do we want to focus on that needle, but we also want to be able to say, okay, so what are the factors that are either contributing to that needle moving, or why didn't it move? So we want to be thinking and learning about it. And eventually, we want to look at a feedback loop, right? So this feedback between the progress we're making and the change that we're seeing happening at the community level. There are options for population level measures. And so for those of you that said, well, I don't really have the resources to be able to track this kind of shared measurement, one of the options is to use existing data sets. And there are a lot of data sets that can be found in our community. There are some data sets that come from Census Canada or the US Census Bureau if you're calling in from the US. So look to those census statistics and say, okay, so are some of this data that Census Canada has, is it relevant to what we're looking for in what we're trying to achieve in our community? In Canada, lots of communities and their community foundations provide a data set called vital signs. So on an annual basis or a semi-annual basis, they will provide information about 8 to 12 different things that are changing in the community, and they provide that through the Vital Signs report. And so sometimes you as an organization don't have to do it, or as a collaborative don't have to do it. That data might already be in your community being published by Vital Signs or being published by Census Canada. Or you can build your own data set. And so the homeless count is a good example of building a data set where, you know, a bunch of citizens get together on an annual basis and do a homeless count, point in time count on one night in the community, and that acts as their data set for that year. Or there are some other instruments that are out there, like early development indicators that are also built specifically for communities. But again, you build them with a lot of other partners in your community. So really look at, you know, first, are there data sets in our communities that other people are capturing, whether it's the municipal government, the community foundation, or Statistics Canada, or do we need to build our own data set? Some of the strengths and limitations around this are that using your own data set using existing data sets, is less costly, there's reliability to it, and there's possible benchmarking over time. Some of the limitations are that there's less flexibility And it might be a little tougher to analyze. When you build your own data set, there's increased validity and you have more control and flexibility, but again, it's costly to develop and maintain, and it might be difficult to benchmark unless other folks join in with you. So it's almost like the first question when you think about shared measurement is really to think about, okay, so what are the existing data sets? What are the data sets we have to build? And then how do we think about those things? So shared measurement has been popularized through the collective impact approach, and it really complements this notion of population level change or population level measurement. Shared measurement is a set of common metrics that ask the question, what progress are we making and how does this information help us make better decisions? Because what we're trying to do when we're working at transformative community change or at collective impact community change is that we are trying to work towards better outcomes for our communities. And so we want to always look at data from the lens of, how is it moving and what are we learning about it and how can we make better decisions based on the information that we have. It's not meant to measure the impact of a single organization or intervention. It's not really focused on programmatic measures, although some programmatic measures can be included in a shared measurement approach. It should not also be meant to be punitive. Really, you should be using the data from a sense-making perspective. The benefits of shared measurement, as we talked about earlier, it gives you clarity of focus. It really helps you track towards a shared goal. It really helps catalyze action. So if you say, okay, we're doing 3 different things, but we see that number 2 is actually giving us more impact and we're able to judge that through shared measurement, then we can put more of our resources on those things that are giving us more impact versus those actions that are having less of an impact overall. Shared measurement is part of an overall evaluation approach. And so it's one part of the bigger ball of evaluation. So a shared measurement system is a system of collecting the data and trying to put it into different kinds of categories. But evaluation really looks at the overall transformative process, community transformation process. It looks at, do we have the right people around the table? Do we have the right programs and approaches in place? So that is really the overall evaluation of which shared measurement is a component of that. It can be both an input to the evaluation process and also an object of the evaluation process. It provides, as an input, it provides data and it helps shape evaluation questions. So we're going to give you a couple of examples of shared measurement processes and how different collaborative groups have kind of looked at this issue and have kind of puzzled their way through it in the hope that this helps answer some of the challenges that you identified in that poll that we had at the beginning. So the first case example is the Seattle Roadmap Project. So the goal of the Seattle Roadmap Project is to double the number of students in South King County and South Seattle who are on track to graduate from college and earn a career credential by 2020. So they want to double the number of students. So they have a certain baseline and they want to double the number from the baseline that they have identified. So what they did for their process is they developed a multi-stepped process to identify, vet, and refine those measures that they felt would be relevant to get to that population level measure of doubling the number of students. So they developed work groups, and they had 4 work groups, and the work groups were really focused around different parts of the school continuum, the K-12, in school, K-12, out of school, and then post-secondary. And the groups were charged with identifying indicators of student success. And so they looked at existing indicators, but also looked at that opportunity to perhaps maybe figure out some new indicators. They identified indicators. They used some criteria around identifying and prioritizing indicators, and we'll look at those criteria in a minute. And then they calibrated indicators across the whole continuum, because there were some indicators that they identified that might cross over one step of the roadmap versus another stage of the roadmap. They shortlisted the top level indicators, and then they identified some supporting indicators. And then finally, the third step in their process was to track the progress and reflect it and refine it over time. So here's how you can see the roadmap and their indicators. So they have indicators around readiness, achievement, and attainment. So they have the first level indicators, which you can see on this slide here. In terms of the readiness indicators, they look at the percentage of children ready to succeed in school by kindergarten. And so they have that kind of as their key indicator. And then in the next stage, they're looking at third grade reading, fourth grade math results, fifth grade science. And so they're really building across the achievement continuum all the way through to attainment. So it helps kind of in some of these collective impact and transformative change processes, you might have a pathway like they have in the Seattle Roadmap project, where you can actually see indicators change for, in this case, students over time. The criteria that they used to select their indicators was an important step in their project. And this is helpful in terms of thinking about, you know, we're gonna need some measures for our collective impact initiative or our transformative change initiative. So is it a valid measure? Is it actually linked to one of the goals or the sub-goals of what we're trying to accomplish? Is it easily understandable? If we were to share this measure with local stakeholders, would they understand it? Is it produced by a trusted source? Is it a source? Is the data coming from government, coming from the school board? Is it comparable across different school districts in the case of the Seattle Roadmap project? But you might also say, is it comparable against different neighborhoods or different cities, depending on the scope and scale that you're working on? Is it affordable for us to gather and report out on a regular basis? Is it available consistently over time? Can it be disaggregated by geography? If you're working across multiple neighborhoods, you want to have a little bit of that kind of disaggregation, saying, okay, so this neighborhood and this neighborhood both have the same kind of data sets, and so they're available consistently across the two neighborhoods. And then, you know, another really important question is, can we get this data disaggregated by ethnicity, by social economic status level, by gender? The other question is there trending? So could we see trend data? Could we get a baseline and then build it over time and really understand that? And so you might have these criteria to influence the data set that you choose for your measures, or you might have some other criteria that are relevant to the work that you're doing in terms of community change. The Roadmap project set up a baseline, and so this is an example of their baseline. So for the Roadmap region, the baseline was 72%, and you could see across the different neighborhoods the relationship of the data to that baseline. So some communities like Kent and Turkwilla were doing really well in terms of kindergarten students attending full-day kindergarten, and then other regions like Auburn and Renton are not doing quite as well. They also, the Seattle Roadmap project produces an annual report where they look at the data and they look at trending over time. So has this data increased over time? Are they on track to getting to their ultimate goal, which is their 2020 target? And so this is a really nice way that they've put together in their reports to show kind of movement over time and whether the movement is positive or negative. And I think that this is a kind of helpful way of thinking about when we're in transformative community change efforts. Is there a way that we can share with the folks that we're working with around the table, but also with our community, how the information, how the data is trending over time? And that actually might give us more attention on what we're trying to accomplish together. So the steps that they used in the design process was to define a common agenda. They identified some criteria. They built governance and working groups around this. They did some due diligence around leveraging what was already being measured. Then they selected their metrics, the data sets that they thought were really important to them, and then they vetted them with stakeholders and really engaged the stakeholders around this process around shared measurement. Some steps you can build into a learning process, because it's not only about the measures that you select, but ultimately you want to be able to see whether those measures are the appropriate measures over time, and whether the strategies that you're using that are linked to the measures actually are the right strategies over time. So they formed learning teams. They reviewed the data that was being tracked on a regular basis. They discussed some of the successes and some of the challenges that were embedded in this kind of shared measurement work. They looked at areas for improvement and did some testing along the way. And then they implemented their changes, and then they spread their changes across the initiative. So it's a fairly simple process, but it's actually an important process in terms of really doing learning and sense making in real time in these in these broad community change efforts. Some of the key takeaways from the Seattle Roadmap example is that it really doesn't, you don't have to wait to look at shared measurement. You can actually start measuring change almost from the very beginning. It doesn't have to be perfect. So often we wait for perfect rather than, just start and then learn from where we started. You can always improve as you go. It does require the kind of solid financial and logistical support to have it happen well. And I would say for those of you that have communities where shared measurement is difficult because of tight resources, look around your community for people that are collecting measures already, and ask them if they're willing to share their measures and if they're willing to be part of the conversation around shared measurement, because they're often experts in our community who have some knowledge and some skills around this work that we may not have. Technology is secondary to this process. The folks at FSG have talked about shared measurement systems, but not every shared measurement approach requires a big system to be structured around it. You just need some kind of way of collecting it and being able to reflect and learn from the data on a regular basis. And, it's shared measurement alone is not sufficient. You really do have to build in continuous learning and look for ways to improve the system as you go. So we're going to now switch over a little bit to some simple tools that might help you with your shared measurement process. And the two tools that we've used a lot at Tamarack with our Vibrant Communities initiative, and also with the communities that we've worked with around collective impact and transformative community change, are around shared measurement mapping and an outcomes diary. So we'll spend a couple of minutes going through each of these. They're fairly simple. They're quite rudimentary tools, but they actually can give you lots of information and insight about your shared measurement process. And so the first tool is the tool called shared measurement mapping. And this was a particularly important tool in our Vibrant Communities work. So Vibrant Communities is an initiative of the Tamarack Institute working with cities, cross-sector roundtables in cities across Canada and the United States, really looking to move the needle on poverty in these cities. And so from 2002 to 2012, we worked with 13 cities across Canada, really trying to understand, how would you move this needle on poverty and what would it look like? And so one of the challenges was that in each community, poverty looked different, right? So in a community of 500,000 people, it might express itself in a certain way, whereas in a smaller, more rural community, it would look a little bit different, or in a city of like Calgary of 3 million people, there would be different elements that were reflected in terms of the poverty process and how you might have interventions around it. And so it's really kind of thinking about, okay, so how can we, knowing that each community is different, how can we measure this in a way that we are comparing apples to apples, not apples to bananas or apples to oranges? And so we came up with this shared measurement framework. And in this case, the communities would report out every 6 months on 4 domains of change. The first domain of change really looked at the process. Were these cross-sectoral roundtables able to get folks with different perspectives around the table? How much engagement did they do of their community? How many articles appeared in the newspaper? Were they changing the conversation about poverty in their community? And so those were process kind of indicators, and that's a very short-term kind of indicator. The second domain of change was really program indicators, and this was really attached to their strategy. So, for example, if they were working on affordable housing, increasing the amount of affordable housing in their community, what were some of the programmatic interventions that they worked on to increase affordable housing, or to get the community to think about half-price bus passes for low-income people? So those are programmatic interventions. They look at different changes in programs. They look at maybe new initiatives that get started. Again, a little bit longer term, but still very programmatically based. The third level of change was policy change. And one of the things that we realized in the Vibrant Community story was that if you could get policies to shift, you actually are embedding change over the longer term. And so it was really important to track the number of policy changes that happened at the local community level, but also were there policy changes happening at other levels of government. And then the final measure was the population level measure. And the population was, the net goal was to reduce the number of people living in poverty in that community. But there's also sub measures that each of the communities had around, things like the number of high school graduation rates, those kinds of things that really tied into their programmatic intervention. So mapping across these 4 categories was very helpful for vibrant communities, and might also be helpful for you if you're thinking about your transformative change initiative. What are some of the process changes that you want to see? What are some of the programmatic changes? What are some policy changes? And what are some population level changes? If you look inside the red circle here, program and population, for those of you that know about results-based accountability, that's where results-based accountability lives. It lives in the interventions that you have at a program level, and how those interventions lead to population level change. So after 10 years of hard work in these 13 communities, they saw an impact because we were tracking the community change on a regular basis. So there was increased community engagement, which was that process change. There was enhanced community innovation that really looked at the programmatic change. There were policies and systems that were shifting as a result of community work. And in several communities across the network, there was a net decrease in the number of people living in poverty. So the Vibrant Communities Initiative used in the early days an approach called the Sustainable Livelihoods Asset Pentagon. And so the Asset Pentagon allowed each community to identify their programmatic measures, and they fit within this asset pentagon. So some of those programmatic interventions were working on personal assets, some were increasing physical assets, social assets, human assets, or financial assets. And the theory of change that the Vibrant Communities Network used is that if you can improve the assets for individuals living in poverty, whether it's personal, physical, social, human, or financial, you can help them move along the trajectory and out of poverty. The results after 10 years were quite significant. So across the 13 cities that were involved in this initiative, there were 439,000 assets that were built that supported 202,000 households. So quite significant, 13 cities if you think about that. And then you can see the other impacts that are here. 53 substantive government policy changes. These were policy changes at the municipal government level, at the provincial government level, and also at the federal government level, and that there were a large number of people across Canada that were engaged in this work, and that there were 256 initiatives that were completed or were in progress. So by identifying measures up front, by setting up a grid on how you're going to calculate measures, by getting to agreement about the framework that they used, which was the Sustainable Livelihoods Asset Pentagon, they were able to track across 13 cities poverty reduction results in a kind of a comprehensive way. And if you go onto the Tamarack website, you'll be able to find some documents that go into more detail around this evaluation process. And we'll also, in the post-webinar email, we'll add some links into this as a result, so that if you're interested, you can dive into it a little bit more deeply. So that's the mapping framework. The second framework is the outcomes diary. And so the outcomes diary is another tool that can be used around shared measurement and really tracking shared measurement as it goes. And what's really important is that you need to have your theory of change or your framework for change. And so in this case, this is an example of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction's framework for change. They have an aspiration of making Hamilton the best place to raise a child, and the theory of change is that if you can make investments across the 5 critical points of investment, those circles at the top of the slide, then you can move the needle on poverty for people and their children and their families living in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And then the box has moved a little bit, but there are 3 strategies. Our community level macro strategy, which is really looking at policy change, critical points of investment strategy, which is looking at investment around those critical points, and then a community-led strategy. And so really thinking about, okay, so how do we build measures around this framework? The Hamilton Roundtable used the outcomes diary and really wanted to use it not only as a way of tracking change, but also as a way of engaging all of its partners in the collective effort and really trying to understand how the actions of its partners across the community were leading to this net reduction in poverty. And so they decided that they needed a system that captured this flow of change in real time and also built into this system feedback loops. And so out came the outcomes diary. So the diary is focused on outcomes. So what are the benefits or changes for individuals in the community? And the targeted individuals were people, children and their families living in poverty. So what were some of the outcomes that were happening? And the approach of the diary was really kind of considering regular reporting and how to do that. Also figuring out, as we diarize these changes, what are we learning? What are the patterns that are emerging? How can the community, and particularly the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, how can it improve its processes as it goes? So here's an example of the outcome diary. It's a pretty simple approach, but it really looked at 3 domains of change. The first domain was impacts on individuals and households living in poverty. The second domain was really looking at whether the community was working better together. If you have a whole bunch of people collaborating together, what was happening in that kind of domain and how could we track it? And then the third domain of change really looked at policy change. And here's a couple of examples that you can see. In this case, the city of Hamilton had some additional resources, about $4 million. And there was a lot of work that was done by the Hamilton Roundtable and its variety of partners to really look at how to get that $4 million spent so that it helped individuals who were living on low and limited income in the community. And the decision was made after lots of sessions and information sessions. It was made to spend that money. The decision was made to spend the money on rental subsidies for low-income families, individuals and families. And so they spent $4 million over 5 years, and that directly benefited 400 families per year. And so you can see the direct impact on individuals and households. The second example is more of how the community works differently together. And this was a case where the school board would bring in speakers, and previous to this, those speakers were only really targeted to build knowledge and expertise within the school board system. And so by partnering with the Hamilton Roundtable, the speaker was opened up to community, and a variety of community workshops were held with over 300 members attending. And so that was a big change, because the school board not only did internal education, but then it also turned outward to its community and did external education as well, to the benefit of growing knowledge around poverty and how to deal with poverty and what the implications of poverty are on a community. So there's kind of two examples. An outcomes diary can be really helpful because it can track these examples in real time and can really give you a sense of, okay, so now if we want to build on the school board, how do we feed back that 300 people attended, that articles were in the newspaper, that the community learned as a result of it? And so it's a great tool. Some of the success factors for an outcomes diary are really paying attention to regular collection of data and the changes as they're occurring, to build in those feedback loops with key stakeholders, and to do sense making and reflection about the trends and patterns that are captured over time. Initially in Hamilton, this was done very much kind of on a regular basis, but now you can almost do an outcomes diary 2.0, which is using survey technology to generate the feedback in real time for our partners, figuring out how to build communication strategies around it to share success stories, and to really spend time in intentional learning to determine the patterns, the flows, and the shifts in changes that are happening in the community. And as you do that, you actually can leverage that, right? And you can ensure that more of those shifts that are happening in the direction you want to see them happen even more frequently and with more depth and durability. So you can build your own outcomes diary. You can see it here, and really think about the community change initiatives that you've been involved in and what changes have you observed over time. And so we've given you a slide here in this deck to do that, but we encourage you to use that slide in your own work. So that's it for shared measurement for this webinar in terms of shared measurement. I think that, the things that you identified at the beginning of the webinar in terms of that this can be costly, it can be time consuming, we may not necessarily have the expertise to fully wrap our minds around it. Don't let those be barriers to you. Think about simple tools that will help you capture data as it changes, or capture changes as they're happening, things like outcomes diary. Look to your community for expertise and for resources in terms of identifying the shared measures, and then helping you kind of understand and puzzle your way through the shared measures. There are folks in every community, whether they're at your municipal government, boards of education, whether they're in the private sector, that are collecting data and looking at data all the time. And so try to connect with them and see if they're willing to come on board and to share their expertise with you. So it doesn't have to be that difficult, and it doesn't also have to be that resource intense. Do what you can, and if you can do even small steps to make some of these changes in your shared measurement approach, you can have big impact on moving the needle on the transformative change in which you're hoping to move. So that's the end of the webinar. Pooja, I think now it's a good opportunity to open it up to questions. So do we have any questions that have been put into the chat box over the course of the webinar?
Yes, we do, although we've had a bit of a shy audience, so feel free to keep the questions coming as Liz is expanding on some of the points you guys have already brought forth. Liz, question from Tamara. Perhaps you can clarify what it means to calibrate indicators.
Okay, yeah. So calibrating indicators, that's a really interesting question, right? Because you want to be able to say, okay, can we get a baseline for this indicator, and what would the baseline be? And then is that data available at the degree to which we need it, right? Or in the scale in which we're trying to use it. So it's really thinking about, can we get it at the scale of the neighborhood or the scale of the subpopulation that we're working with? And some measures you might be able to get that fairly readily, and then others it's much more difficult to access that kind of subpopulation data. And so then you've got to think about, is there another measure that we would have to look at, or are we okay with only using, the measure citywide versus neighborhood-wide?
Great. Very interesting. Thank you for your question, Tamara. Next, we have a question from Tony, who I think has left us. How do we truly know that collected data in someone's project is valid to suit our needs?
So that's a really good question, Tony. I would look at the kind of the piece from the Seattle Roadmap project, kind of where they started to look at, are these indicators the right indicators, and what are the criteria that we would put into place for selecting certain indicators versus other indicators. So it does go back to your framework, right? So if you say, okay, so we're trying to move the needle on poverty in our community, and our strategies are around boosting people's incomes, that framework will influence which indicators you choose. So your framework and your strategies influence which indicators that you choose. So there might be some data that your partners are collecting that aren't relevant to the framework or the strategies, or are not collected in a frequent enough way, or don't actually reflect the whole population, don't fit some of the criteria that you've agreed to. So it is a little bit of sorting through. And in that case, if I was working at community change, I would bring in some evaluation experts in my community, or some data experts, to help me puzzle that out and to help me look at that in a way that their expertise could really inform the approach. And they would be able to tell you, yeah, this makes sense, or no, this actually isn't collected with a frequency, or it actually won't show you, it won't inform your theory of change or your framework for change.
Great, thank you for that, Liz. Our next question comes from Nancy, and perhaps there's a bit of confusion about what trail builders means. Who are the trail builders, and what's their role?
Oh yeah, so that's a really good question, Nancy. So the language that Tamarack used for its vibrant community partners was each of these cities were called trail builders, because it was initial design of vibrant communities with these 13 cities. It was called an action learning experiment, and so these were 13 cities that volunteered in the early days to step up and try this approach, bringing multi-sector partners together and try to move the needle on poverty. This was before the collective impact framework came out. And so they were basically building the trail. If you know anything about Canada, and I'm sure you have this in the US as well, that there are trails, and someone needs to, in order for a trail to occur, someone needs to break the trail or build the trail from the very beginning. And so we use this language with the first 13 cities in the Vibrant Communities Network, because they were blazing the trail or building the trail so that other cities could learn from their experience.
Great.
Good question.
Yeah. Next question is coming from Christian. When building a network of organizations to undertake shared measurement, how do you overcome initial hesitancy to take part?
Yeah, you will get that for sure at the very beginning, because often measurement is used to judge, right? And so if you say, really one of the values or one of the criteria in this shared measurement approach is not to judge, but to learn and to work towards better community outcomes, everybody can buy into, and hopefully everybody is working towards better community outcomes, right? But if you use the measures to judge, one organization versus another organization, you're probably going to create high levels of mistrust and vulnerability. And so I think you want to set out fairly early on kind of what are some of the values and principles behind our shared measurement approach, and what are some of the criteria that we might put into place. And so I think that one for learning and sense making is a very important kind of principle. And to not judge, to just say, we really want to learn about what's working, what's not working. And once we learn what's not working, then we can build our strategies in a way that they can become even more effective and maybe bust some of those things that aren't working.
I'm glad you touched on vulnerability, because Christian's, his second part to his question was that being transparent about your impact can be vulnerable for organizations who may rely heavily on grants or fundraising. So how do you create that safe space in which they feel safe to participate?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, because what you could be doing if it feels like it's very vulnerable, you could use what I like to call the cloak of the collaborative, right? Which is to say, here are the overall results or patterns that we're seeing in the community, and you wouldn't necessarily highlight, something that, is highlight and publicly disclose, something that is, significant. You might internally look at that and say, okay, how can we improve this system? But it does allow you to kind of think about, okay, so how do we share this information, share this data in a way that is impactful for our community, but is also in a way that we can learn from and improve, work on continuous improvement within our collaborative.
Great.
And Pooja, if something isn't working, wouldn't you rather know that than not know that, right? I think sometimes we think, oh my goodness, we'll be judged because it's not working. But I'd rather know that it wasn't working and then free up those resources to do something else that might work better. And so you only are able to uncover those kinds of things when you look at the data and you say, look, we're not getting the same number of people out to this program or this service, or we're seeing these trends in our community. Let's try to figure this out together, and let's try to figure out how to get this trending in a different direction.
Absolutely. So our next question, very interesting question from Kathy. When the change you are hoping to affect is over a long-term period of time, over a generation or more, do you have some ideas as to how to create short-term achievable measures?
Yeah, and so the folks at the FSG and the Collective Impact Forum have done some really good work around pulling together guides for evaluating collective impact. And so even if you're working on transformative community change issues, I think these guides are relevant to your work as well. They're downloadable from the Collective Impact Forum website. They say that just as we in our shared measurement mapping for vibrant communities had, program, process, progress, or process, program, policy, and population, you actually do want to kind of figure out what are the measures over time that are most relevant. In the guides to evaluating collective impact, they say that in the first year, so if you think about collective impact efforts as taking 5 years to get to population level change of some sort, the first year is really the fidelity of the process that you've implemented. You know, are you putting into place this multi-sector roundtable? Are you putting into place, you know, a backbone and the right resources? So that's year 1, 2. Years 2 to 3, 4 are really looking at behavioral changes. So are things changing for the folks that you're focusing your intervention on? And also, are there behavioral changes happening in how the community is working together, how funding is being aligned around this priority? So it's really looking at 2 levels of behavioral changes. And then the final level that you usually get to in years, 4, 5 are really the population level changes. So in some cases with some transformative change processes, you only might see, you know, fairly small population level changes in that first kind of go round in the first 5 years. And then, you know, as you're learning and you're really thinking about which interventions are working and which ones you can let go of, you can begin to ramp up, you know, your interventions in a way that leads to higher degrees of population level changes. So that's the pattern that we're seeing in this transformative change process.
Wonderful. You've actually answered all the questions from the audience, so thank you very much, Liz.
Great, and we're nearly at the end of time, so that worked out well.
Yes. Great. So thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation, and many thanks to you all for joining us. Your comments and questions have helped to make this a very thought-provoking conversation. Also, as promised, in a few days, we will email you the recording of the webinar along with all the other materials related to this call, so you guys can sit tight for that. We'd also like to talk to you about some events that are upcoming. We have some incredible learning opportunities that are just around the corner. We're hosting our annual Collective Impact 3.0 workshop, a 3-day offering that will explore the latest in the practice of collective impact from experts, practitioners, and early adopters of the work. This workshop is about a month away, so don't hesitate to sign up if you're currently working on a collective impact initiative. As a reminder, special rates are available for Ontario Trillium Foundation grantees, so do reach out if you want to take advantage of that discount. We will also be hosting a new evaluation masterclass series that will be led by evaluation pioneer Michael Quinn Patton and experienced evaluator Mark Cabage. We'll be exploring the principles-focused evaluation approach and demonstrate its relevance and application in a range of settings. These one-day events will take place in Toronto, Regina, Calgary, Vancouver, beginning March 12th. So we encourage you to follow the link on your screen if that perks your interest as well. Lastly, in April, we're holding a workshop in Kitchener, Ontario, all about asset-based community development with a focus on neighborhood development and community health. This will be a rare opportunity to learn from Cormac Russell and John McKnight, 2 of the world's top trainers in asset-based community development. Registration links for these events will be shared in the email you receive after today's webinar, along with the links to sign up for the next installment of this Transformative Action webinar series. To learn more about upcoming learning opportunities, including workshops and free webinars like this one, visit us at www.tamarackcommunity.ca. We also encourage you to take a minute to complete a short webinar survey to offer feedback on how you've enjoyed today's call. The link is on your screen and will be sent out in your email as well. Thanks again, everyone, and hope you have a wonderful day.